Hi, I'm George Freestone, and I'm back to help you with the 17th episode within our baseball journey that tells the story of my wife's and my visits to all 30 major league ballparks and their fun cities, as well as four obsolete ones. And today's visit is to Detroit, to Comerica Park, where we saw the Tigers hosting the Kansas City Royals. Comerica Park really is a beautiful park. And here you can see a picture that I took from center field early on in our visit. You can see the stands aren't very crowded. Batting practice is going on behind me. And so it's early in our visit. We typically walk around the ballpark to try and take in each and every ballpark's attractions and nuances. And we did that here. And I just happened to take a picture from center field back into the stands. Let me remind you of the trip that we were on when we visited Detroit. We left our home near Reading, Pennsylvania, and drove to upstate New York. We saw some friends. We took in some attractions near Corning, then drove to Toronto, saw the Blue Jays, and enjoyed Toronto, the city, and the attractions there. And then we left Toronto and drove west through Canada to Windsor, crossed the border there to Detroit, and that's where we had the chance to join up with our children that live in Chicago, our daughter and her husband. And with that, I am going to start sharing my desktop so I can pull up this slide and we can tell the story about our visit to Comerica, which took place in August of 2015. That's significant because I'm a Mets fan, as you probably know, if you've watched any of these episodes. And during July of 2015, the Tigers traded Yoenis Cespedes to the Mets, and he'll come up a little bit later in our story. But first, let me call attention to the game. And again, just as I have in many of the other episodes, this box right here is a link that will take you to the box score and very detailed stats, including probability of win as the innings proceed and the play-by-play. So you get the whole breakdown for the game just by clicking on that particular link. This game was a exciting game for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was an offensive display. There were 20 hits in total, and the resolution of the game didn't take place until the ninth inning. It was tied going into the ninth inning, 6-6. But in the bottom of the ninth, Detroit won it with a two-run homer. Ryan Madson hit that two-run homer in the bottom of the ninth to actually win the game for the Tigers. So it was quite an exciting game, quite an offensive game. And I've got several pictures that relate to the ballpark on this crowded slide. We'll talk about some of them as we proceed. This is another view of a black and white of that same shot from center field. Comerica Field with the Tigers emblem. We got Tigers all over the place. This is my daughter, our daughter Andrea, and her husband Kyle, as we were checking out the stadium early on. We had very nice seats. You can see that from these two pictures. A little bit of a zoom lens helped there to catch the batter in action, but it's really a beautiful park. And one of the things that we'll talk about are actually some of these statues that you've seen pictured here and for many of the other parks that we've talked about as well. So I did mention that our Chicago kids met us in Detroit, and so we had a chance to catch up with them, and they, I think, enjoyed themselves also at this particular game. Just like all the other slides that I've created episodes for so far, there are photos that are available, and you can just click on the photos link, and it will give you several hundred photos about what we did when we were in Detroit, both the game, and then some of the attractions that we took in as well. Okay, the People Mover is a nifty name for the elevated train that is right here. And you can see it's advertising Greektown, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But it's all painted up and very attractive here. So the People Mover is a very efficient way to get around downtown. And I just happened to take a picture of a very attractive version of that People Mover right there. Now, this statue is of Ty Cobb, and you can see it close up here. You can see it from across the field here. And what's interesting is you've got three players here, Norton, Cobb, and Greenberg. And you've got numbers for two of the three. And so the trivia question for today is, why doesn't Ty Cobb have a number? And the answer to that question is because at the time that Ty Cobb played, numbers were not on jerseys for the various players. So that's why there is no Ty Cobb number. Now, a second thing that I want to mention about Ty Cobb is when we visited Turner Field in Atlanta, there was a statue of Ty Cobb there as well. But Ty Cobb spent his career basically focused on Detroit and being a Tiger. So why was he on a statue in Atlanta? Well, it's because that's where his home was. He is known as the Georgia Peach, as this bullet says right there. And that was interesting. And I thought I'd relate that in this episode when we talked about the Tigers in Ty Cobb. Okay. When we were in Detroit, we saw many things beyond the game. We saw the Hard Rock Cafe. You can see that here. Every city that has a Hard Rock Cafe is something that I will urge us to stop off at, if nothing else, to pick up another T-shirt. But Detroit has a Hard Rock Cafe, or they did in 2015. One of the things that is unique about Detroit, of course, music-wise, is Motown music. And there's a lovely little museum with the Hitsville, USA sign out front. And interestingly, they didn't allow photos inside the museum at the time we visited. So I have nothing basically inside of the museum, but I have several shots of outside and the building that it housed. A lot of musical history there for those of us that were active during that particular time. It gave us a chance to reminisce about some great tunes. Another thing that we did when we were in Detroit is we visited the Henry Ford Museum. Now, that is a tribute to vehicles, to trains, cars, and automobiles. And one of the classic photos that I had from the Henry Ford was this particular Ford, which, again, for those of you that were around at the time, will no doubt be able to tell me what the model is because of the distinctive nature. That's an Edsel named for Edsel Ford, and not necessarily the most successful model within the Ford lineup, but still, it's a lovely museum. And in addition to the museum, there is a outside gardens and village known as Greenfields available, and they have vintage antique automobiles running around, and they have many other attractions that you can stop in and see. Now, downtown, when we were at Comerica, we also are within spitting distance of Ford Field. Ford Field is, of course, where the Detroit Lions play during football season. And one of the interesting aspects about Ford Field is that the playing field for Ford Field is not at ground level, but is lower than ground level. So they dug a pit, and then the stadium didn't have to be quite so tall. So the playing field is actually below ground level for Ford Field. Let's see, what else do we have here? We had plenty of good food. Two significant restaurants that we enjoyed were Roast, and we have a sign for that here. That was at the time one of Michael Simon's featured restaurants, and we ran into in Cleveland. We had a chance to eat at several of his restaurants there. He's big on meat. That's his claim to fame. And we enjoyed a meal at Roast. But then for a little bit of a compliment, we also ate at Joe Moore Seafood. And here you can see a lovely picture of the four of us from that particular dinner that we enjoyed at Joe Moore. Okay, I mentioned while we were at the game that we had good seats. Indeed, we did. And just as a nature of conversation, as you might expect, there were a lot of Detroit fans around us. Well, they listened to us talk, and it became evident to them that I was a Mets fan. And given that it was August of 2015 and Cespedes was only traded to the Mets in July of 2015, that definitely came up. And so the fans were at the time, the Detroit fans were lamenting the fact that Detroit had let Cespedes go to the Mets. Now, Cespedes had I'd say, a good run with the Mets. He had to retire, though, because of an unusual event. He had a ranch in Florida, and he suffered serious ankle injuries from a wild boar on his ranch. So that kind of took him out of Major League Baseball, that and COVID. I guess he didn't want to play, and then for whatever reason, he thought maybe he had peaked and retired in 2020. But his stats while at Detroit and the other teams that preceded Detroit, and then with the Mets, were pretty consistent throughout. He was like a 280, 290 hitter across the board. And so a little bit of an interesting story about Cespedes there and the fans that were behind us who were giving me a hard time because we had taken Cespedes off their hands. I mentioned that this was an exciting game with the walk-off home run. Another thing that I'd like to mention is, like many of these older franchises, and Detroit's an older franchise, they have quite a history of radio announcing that goes along with the game. Well, Ernie Harwell is a 42 season radio man, and many of those seasons, well, I guess 42 of those seasons were with the Tigers. He spent, in addition to those 42 seasons, another, let's see, 12 before he got to Detroit. So a total of 54 seasons. And this is a statue where Detroit is paying tribute to Ernie Harwell. And I'm also fortunate to have an audiobook of Ernie Harwell relating some of his more significant reflections on being a radio man that long. And that was very enjoyable and a nice tribute to, I think, a very nice man. You can see some day and night photos of the city of Detroit. Here are some night photos of the Renaissance Center, which is GM's headquarters, but it's also a hotel. This is a daytime view of the same Renaissance Center. That center spire, I think, is a Marriott hotel. And many years ago, I had the pleasure of actually staying in that hotel at the Renaissance Center. I guess this is a view out across the river into Canada from the Renaissance Center on the back side, facing east over into Canada from the Detroit side. Last thing I'll mention is Greektown. You can see three of the four of us waltzing through Greektown. Here's a nighttime picture of Greektown. Greektown is a commercial and entertainment district named for the immigrant community. And someplace on here, if I can find it, we have a photograph of pastries. Yep, the Astoria pastry shop. I don't have the pastries themselves, but we picked up quite a few to take back to the hotel with us. I think I've talked about virtually all of the photos here. Maybe here's one that I haven't. There was a carousel, and this is the Big Cat center or whatever part of the ballpark, kind of a place where you can get some food as well as enjoy a couple of attractions for kids as well. Is there anything else that I haven't talked about? Um, Lots of tigers, lots of tigers. And of course, the park is noteworthy, I would say, in that they have a landing strip, kind of still sand or whatever, the ballpark dirt from the mound back to home plate. Okay, I think that may bring to a close our discussion about Detroit. I believe our 18th episode is going to start by taking us out to the West Coast. So that will be our next episode. I thank you for your attention here, and I look forward to episode 18.